Welcome to Classical Etc., a show that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
All right, so we're back again for another episode of Classical Etc. And today's episode, we're going to talk a lot about science and the role of science in classical education. But before we get there, I actually want to ask you guys, what are you reading right now? Tanya, what are you reading right now?
I'm finishing up Mere Christianity for the third time.
Okay.
And I'm reading Hope in Times of Fear by Timothy Keller, getting ready for the resurrection, and a fluff book. And I'm reading Farmer Boy.
Nice.
Because Lee and I are working on a little project.
So you mentioned Mere Christianity. You've read it before, you said.
This is my third time.
What do you like about Mere Christianity?
I feel like it has been foundational to my faith, and I didn't really realize that until the third time. When I started reading it again, and Ian and I were talking about it because he's been rereading it too. And
Ian is someone who works here.
Oh, yes. Ian that I work with. And he and I both were just kind of shocked at how much it had influenced our faith and our belief about certain doctrines.
Have you guys read Mere Christianity? Paul?
I've started it. That's about as far as I've gotten.
Okay, where
I
are
don't
you
know.
at?
I think I got through part 2. If I'm right, there's five parts, I think.
I don't
I'm
remember
through
how many
second part.
parts.
And what are your initial impressions?
My initial impressions, maybe I have to defend this with saying, because I was born and raised Catholic, like I didn't grow up having to define my doctrine, right? So I dove straight into philosophy and theology. And so as I'm reading it, I'm like, yeah. Like it's nothing earth shattering to me, or having to help me figure out my, where I'm at. And so I'm just, it feels like in some ways philosophy and theology light to me.
It feels mere.
It feels mere. Yes.
Yeah, he's like definitely making arguments that are compelling.
Yeah,
but it's very relational and logical, and it's not rooted in kind of a deeper research or something like that.
Right. And I mean, and I think it's, for what it's attempting to do, I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I think when I read it the first time, I was very young, and I was really trying to figure things out. And I think, it's in our apologetics class for seniors in high school, and I think that's the perfect time for that book because it really does help you think about why you believe the things you do and what you're going to go. I don't agree with everything in Mere Christianity, but it did heavily influence me, and I do think it's a very good book to send students to college with. But I do wonder if I were reading it the first time now, if I would feel the same way about it as I do.
Because your beliefs would already be somewhat solid.
But I feel like that book made my beliefs somewhat solid.
Yeah, I read it in high school, and it was very foundational for me. But I returned to it in seminary, and definitely didn't find it as gripping because I think of what you guys are talking about. Martin, have you read it?
I have. I've read it several times. I read it first, I think, maybe in late high school, again in college, and then I taught it at Highlands Latin School.
And that
about
makes
10
a
years
difference
ago.
when
And it does
you
make a
teach it.
difference. And it struck me once again last time I read it, just his casual approach. He talks in normal, everyday language. Richard Brookhiser, the political writer, once said that, Chesterton, it was a contrast with Chesterton, which is an interesting contrast because Chesterton affected C.S. Lewis's thoughts so much. Chesterton addresses a crowd or a rally. Lewis addresses you. He said, Chesterton charts the world, Lewis grasps your lapel.
Sure.
And it's so true. And the last time I read it, I was reading it along with Chesterton's Orthodoxy because they're both in our Christian Studies program in high school. And that contrast really struck me, how Chesterton is so fabulous in the way he writes. And Lewis is just very plain. And he's the best explainer that you can find for anything, and particularly for Christianity.
every couple of weeks when we do these episodes, I want to check in with you as to what you guys are reading. But due to time constraints, Martin, tell us what you're reading, and then we'll move on after that.
Reading several things. I'm reading My Antonia by Willa Cather. I'm reading Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, and finishing up a Louis L'Amour book.
Nice.
My Antonia is my kind of primary novel. I have one kind of classic novel I'm always reading, and I listen to books, novels primarily on Audible, because I have such a long drive to work. But My Antonia has been recommended by people. I've been doing a lot of reading about the American West in the last couple of years, and it's a very highly regarded book in terms of a realistic portrayal of the West. That book is mentioned with O.E. Rolvag's Giants in the Earth, which was written in Norwegian. It was Norwegian immigrants. And of course, in Willa Cather's book, you see a lot of these immigrants from European countries. And you don't until you read books like this, you don't really realize how much of the settlement of the Western frontier was by immigrants. And so it's just a great story. She's such a great descriptive writer. So I'm really enjoying that.
That's great. Have you read that, Tanya?
My Antonia. Yeah, I've read everything Willa Cather wrote. I really like her. How about you?
What am I reading, or
Yes.
have I read Willa Cather?
I don't think you've read Willa Cather.
I have not read Willa Cather, no.
Okay, well, maybe you can read My Antonia. Maybe we should be reading what each other's reading. I just finished Hannah Coulter again for our Memoria Press little book club. Did you? Oh, you've read Hannah Coulter.
I have read Hannah Coulter. Right now, I'm reading Plutarch's Lives.
Okay.
When we've been making these famous men videos that Memoria Press
Yes.
puts out, I always read the live sections, and some of the stories are just fantastic. And so I wanted to go back and not just read selectively. I wanted to try and read kind of just front to back. The sections are like between 25 to like 40 pages. So you can sit down in one or two readings and you can read the whole section. And so I've enjoyed doing that recently. I'm also reading a modern novel that's very interesting called White Noise by Don DeLillo. It's kind of an interesting character. And then I am
Is
reading...
that fiction?
It's fiction. Mm-hmm.
Look at you reading more fiction.
Yeah, trying to read a little more fiction. And then I'm also reading a book about the Milwaukee Bucks championship run last year in 2021 when they won the title, because I'm a big Milwaukee Bucks fan.
What sport is that?
It's basketball. Yeah.
I thought Milwaukee, it sounds like hockey.
Yeah. Well, we don't have a hockey team.
Oh, well, that's odd.
Paul, what are you reading
Wisconsin.
right now?
The novel I'm reading is Monsignor Quixote by Graham Greene. I think our listeners are going to get tired of me talking
Do you
about
like
Graham Greene.
that?
I'm only a little bit into it, and I found the first chapter hysterical. I mean, it's
funny.
It's funny.
I thought it sounded good when you were telling me.
Yeah,
that.
the synopsis is funny. But the first chapter, the priest, Monsignor Don Quixote, who then gets promoted to be Monsignor Quixote because he fed this Italian bishop. He plied him with wine and fed him horse meat. He's just a very simple man, right? And it's Graham Greene's, I think, tribute to Cervantes and sort of dealing with things that Graham Greene often deals with when it comes to faith. And so I was listening to Tracy Lee Simmons' Memoria College videos on Brideshead Revisited, and because he's talking about Evelyn Waugh, he brings up Graham Greene, and he says it's dangerous for me. This is Tracy saying it's dangerous for him anytime he picks up Graham Greene, because as soon as he reads one, he wants to go read them all, everything he wrote. And that's exactly what I'm going through. Is I'm on a Graham Greene kick.
So read them all. I love to read an author like that. Somebody you really like. Mm-hmm. I really like it if the characters are connected, like book to book.
Oh,
to
like
book.
Wendell Berry's world.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Yes.
So I wanted to move to do something else a little bit different that we haven't done in any of our conversations before, and that is we are, book people, and we work at a book company, and we love the books that we write and that we work on. And I wanted to actually talk about individual books with you guys and the roles that those books have in our curriculum, but then also just the ways that experiences that we've had with these books, because for some, they may just seem like a piece of curriculum, but for us, these are books that we are thinking about a lot. And so I chose one to fit our theme of science. That is the Book of Trees. And they teach this in the 6th grade at Highlands School in the Memoria Press curriculum. It's in the 7th grade. So, Tanya, what's your relationship to the Book of Trees?
Before the Book of Trees was Cheryl Lowe, and I taught 6th grade, and she wanted me to teach trees, and I didn't know enough about trees to satisfy her. So she would come into my classroom with her big trees binder and teach trees to my students. And it was fascinating. So basically, I sat at her feet one more time in a science class every week. She would show up to my class to teach trees without fail. Like, I thought when she first said that, I thought, oh, what if she doesn't show up and I'm going to be stuck here without a curriculum? But she had this big binder and it had leaves, different leaves. And she was so excited about trees. And she really ramped up my students to be excited about trees. And so we had to do trees. But this is after, we'd had that couple of years where we did survey courses where we really didn't teach anything in depth. And so at the point where she decided we were going to do nature study, trees, for me, as I told Paul earlier today, we were talking about this, that this doing trees in the 6th grade, I think, is just the culmination for her of the nature studies, because trees were her very favorite thing. In fact, the day she died, like hours before she died, she was telling Brian and Lee that they needed to make sure that they had particular trees here on this campus labeled and that the students learned to observe them. Like, she named them. Unfortunately, none of us can remember which ones of those. We've labeled them all because we, just in the shock of it all and I guess the trauma, we've talked about it since and we couldn't remember which trees she particularly cared about. So our students have to do them all.
Yeah. Paul, why do you think it's important that grade school students would study trees for an entire year like they do at Highlands School?
I lament my lack of tree knowledge. And this is going to reflect a little bit poorly on Cheryl, because I remember when she was my teacher, I remember going out around that church building, whichever church that was, over on Barrett or something, and identifying trees with her as a little kid. And, so there's like 2 trees that I can identify that I remember from that class. And I'm constantly lamenting when I'm out walking through the woods, whether I'm hunting, whether I'm doing something on the farm, whether it's just for a hike. And I I just sort of see the world non-observantly, because I can't, in nature, it's hard for me to pick out, this is that kind of tree, this is that kind of tree. And I can pick out a few, but I was just recently out clearing out some trees for my pigs, just try to give them more space. And, I'm out there with the chainsaw cutting those down, and my dad is with the wood chipper, feeding stuff in. So we get wood chips for everything else we're doing. And at one point he stops me, like comes up and taps me on the shoulder. He goes, "That's a locust. Leave that. You're going to get good fence posts out of that." And this is without leaves on it or anything. He noticed from the tree itself. And I feel that I'm lacking in something because I don't have that knowledge of the world. And it's a world that I live in. Right.
Which is exactly her point in nature studies, is to give students an appreciation and knowledge of the world they live in. And what better use of our time? She was always big on time on task. Sure. And there's nothing better than, but I feel the same way about birds. I don't recognize the names of birds or their songs, and I hear them and think, that was a real hole in my education too.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like if I could go out and recognize the distinct songs and associate it with the name of a bird, I would be able to actually perceive what I'm hearing. But instead, it's just like white noise because I don't quite have a grasp on.
It would be so exciting to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, Martin, when you reflect on the importance of trees for a grammar school student, do you think that there's something unique about a student studying them in 6th grade versus going and specializing on trees later after they graduate from high school or college and just making it a hobby?
Well, I think one of the points of any kind of natural science is wonder. And children have an ability sometimes to wonder more better than adults. I think you need to start that early. I remember when my dad grew up in the hills of South Carolina, and I remember visiting my grandmother when I was little. We drove across the United States because I grew up in California. He had moved out to California. And I remember going there, and I remember him taking me around and showing me the things in their yard, the things that he had grown up with. There was an apple tree out there with a beehive under it, and there was an old shed where his dad was a carpenter, and he learned carpentry from his father, and he would make things in the shed. And I remember him one day pointing. There was this line of pine trees along the property line. I mean, they were huge. And he says, you see that line of trees over there? And I said, yeah. And he said, I planted those as little seedlings. And I remember just being amazed that something that big had been planted by a boy probably my age. Just the wonder of the effect you can have on something and how time will cultivate that for you. And that occurred to me the other day. I thought, is that the reason why I think trees are so cool now? Is because my dad, I just thought that was so cool that my dad had done that. And I don't know a lot about trees. I don't know all the things in these books. I have that set of books under my coffee table because I'm wanting to look more and just to be able to name things. But I planted a lot of trees on my property. To plant something like this, I mean, just in terms of the hands-on thing about this, I planted two little seedling tulip poplars, literally 2 feet high in my front yard. One of them is 30 feet high now. And to watch these things that you planted grow, and you get to know them sort of intimately. There's this big oak where my mother lives in Kansas that's over 200, 300 years old, called Searles Oak. And we came back last time, and we always try to walk by to see this great big old oak tree. And I was trying to get the acorns from it so I could plant someone related to Searles Oak in my yard. And she says, well, you have those big tulip poplars in front. Yeah. I said, yeah. And the big one, I'm going to name it Cothran's poplar. And I've got trees, and so I can identify all the trees that I planted. I mean, that way you got some this hands-on relation to it. You know, I can spot a red bud, tulip poplars. I've got a catalpa, a northern catalpa in my backyard. Things I bought from nurseries and planted. That has helped me to identify trees. But you know, maples and oaks, there are so many different varieties. That's why I wanted to delve into this book a little, was because I want to know the difference between the different kinds of maples and the different kinds of oaks. You know, and then there's all these hybrids that they've come out with that make this job more difficult. But yeah, it's just, they're fun to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Now, there's one question I didn't prep you guys with, and that is, this book of trees is an introduction to botany through the study of trees. Why do you think that it was important that we introduce botany through the study of trees and not necessarily some other kind of shrubbery or plant life that we could have introduced botany through?
Well, I think the trees are sort of the most apparent, right? I mean, it's an example Aristotle uses, right? I mean, it's you walk out the door, you're not paying attention to the grasses. Now, grasses are fascinating, actually. When you start having when I had to start learning about grasses for pasture, I was shocked about the amount of grasses that were out there. But in sort of our normal everyday lives, trees, I think, are sort of the most
prominent.
Say that again?
Prominent,
yeah, and easy to most knowable in some ways, because you know it's not something real small and real fine. It's a big thing, and so you want to introduce the student to that which is sort of most in their face, right? And when you're trying to introduce a science like that, I think
anyone who's trying to patch a dry spot in their yard with grass is amening and saying yes to your comment of how many grasses there are. It's miserable.
You're right.
Yes, we have 2 different colors in our yard as we speak.
Yeah. I think another reason why introducing botany through the study of trees is maybe an interesting choice is because we are fronting the taxonomies and the identification of these different kinds of things that our students experience in nature, like trees, mammals, insects, over top of the dissecting of the different things that they're going to meet in science. We do a little bit of that, botany, insects, and putting in discrete parts, but the primary goal of our nature studies is give them names for the things that they're going to see.
Yes.
And then later on, they're going to dive deeper.
That's absolutely true.
And I think, a lot of people don't know that Aristotle wrote works on botany and zoology.
Right.
The two kinds of biology. And I always thought that's interesting. The greatest, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, and he was very much interested in plants and animals. I don't know what that says, but
Well, I think it's a good transition into kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about with you all, and that is that we were at a conference in Toledo the last couple of days, and one of the comments that I got from someone is they asked, is classical education for word people? And I mentioned this to Tanya.
And I said, what are word people?
And I responded, someone who has an affinity for the humanities or who likes reading and writing, but doesn't really like math or isn't really that interested in the sciences.
So that would be me. I am a word person.
So the question is classical education for the people who are interested in science? Because all classical educators go around talking about Latin and great books. So what about the sciences?
Well, I think first of all, in some ways, science is the new religion of our day. And so it's never been knocked down several pegs like Latin and phonics and reading have been. And so I think, as the classical movement started, it was just sort of a natural thing to say, we don't need to hammer that. That needs to be taught. It's an essential part of education, but it doesn't need to be hammered, But absolutely, science needs to be part of classical education. Classical education is for everybody.
Well, and I think you have to make a distinction between nature study and science in its modern utilitarian sense, because the tendency is very different. The tendency in a lot of modern science has been toward taking everything apart and trying to get down to its smallest element, when that's not what nature study. This is not what Charles Darwin was doing. This is not what any of the great naturalists were doing. They were just beholding the thing as a whole thing. They were beholding an animal as an animal and trying to explain its wholeness, not just dissecting it. Just dissecting things is going to tell you something, but it's not going to tell you a lot of other things that you probably really want to know. So the reason I really like the way our program, and I didn't come up with these labels till later after we had done it, but nature and narrative. We want to be able to go out and experience these things as whole things and wonder at a tree, at an animal, at an insect, and not just think about what's inside them and how we can cut them up and do all that sort of thing. That and this science as a human project. All right, there's this whole story of discovery, of scientific discovery, that's there for us to learn. And in like the Tyner books that we sell, there's a lot about the story of science and the great discoverers and how the things we know about nature were discovered and the human inventiveness that went into it. I think those are the things that non-scientists, which is most of us, need to know. Our whole science education is set up to train scientists. But most of us are not going to be professional scientists. Most of us are going to be people in the natural world who just want to know things like trees. And so our program is not meant to train professional scientists. It's meant for normal people to be able to appreciate nature better. And I think that's the strength of our program.
In the grammar school. But then when we get our ninth graders do biology, like a high school biology course using a high school biology text, we do chemistry, we do physics. So we get there, but Cheryl's whole point was that there's no way you can prepare for that in grammar school anyway. So why waste your time giving students things to do that aren't a good use of their time? an appreciation of nature before we start dissecting things, which we end up doing in high school, which is also the reason we carry Nature's Beautiful Order. When we first were considering that, I remember, Paul, you told me that it's really good before we get to high school science because it treats the whole animal as a being, and before we dissect it into a million pieces.
Well, and I mean, when we talk about logic, right? I mean, you've got, your two sort of skills, which is analysis, breaking something down into its parts, and synthesis, which is putting those parts back into a whole, right? And so you start to see the relationships of those things. And so if we're really teaching science classically, like the classical model has something to say to science teachers of you need to think about this in a relationship as you're teaching students how to think. You need to start, instead of just saying, here's a list of, the different parts of a cell or whatever. Yeah, they need to know that. But then this goes together to, all those are parts of a cell, and you add these cells, these kinds of cells together, and this is what, creates this organ or whatever, and to help them think about it, not purely, as Martin is saying, to dig down into the tiniest fragment, but to say, okay, now how does this come together into a whole?
Right. And there's a friend of one of my kids who is who wanted to go into botany, and she went out to California to go to school, and she had a very hard time trying to find a professor to work with who was actually interested in botany and not some commercial application of molecular biology or something, because that's where all the money is. In the Wall Street Journal had an article about this recently, about how this sort of nature deficit disorder that the Federal Department of Forestry cannot find biologists who are able to identify plants. I mean, this is a sorry situation. It's because that is just not a priority in our education. And yeah, that requires taking biology and all those things. But still, the point is that one of the major aspects of science always needs to be going back to nature itself and not how you can use it for some commercial application.
Right. Creating wonder in our students at nature rather than the ability to master it or manipulate it.
It's sort of that Baconian mastering nature to see what you can get from it, as opposed to just being able to wonder at God's creation.
I have a story in that regard where I was just mastered by nature.
Sure.
I was telling Tanya this morning, I got piglets over the weekend, and I thought I had it all figured out. I had my electric fence. They were going to be mastered by me. And I was chasing these piglets through the pasture. They got through the fence. It was hysterical, but I also realized that they've bested me. Like, I've hit my limit, And
so you basically are admitting you were outwitted by a bunch of pigs.
I was outwitted by a bunch of piglets. Absolutely.
Just want to get that on the record.
Strong. These little 30-pound things, they are so strong, right? And fast, really fast. And yet they're on 4 legs and I'm on 2. Like, you'd think I could, anyway. But it just teaches you, like, when you understand nature as a whole, like as not as the parts of the pig, right? I mean, honestly, that pig's going to get butchered. Where he's going to be great,
and then the parts will become very important.
Those parts will be very important. But like, now, my first experience with a pig, which this is not the first time I've dealt with pigs, but golly, this was this got out of hand. But is the whole pig, right? Like, I get to experience that pig as a being. Right, and not just its parts, and it's marvelous.
Yeah. And then when you fall in love with it, it's going to be really hard to slaughter it.
It was really hard last year.
Yeah.
You bring up a good point about, seeing nature as a whole. And I was thinking, in response to the question, I wonder what you guys think about the question itself. Can we really say that some people are, quote unquote, word people, even if you know what that means, and some people are math people? And I was reflecting on this, Tanya, because you and I were talking about this. You in this podcast just a minute ago, you said, I'm not a number person, but you also started your own tax business. You oversee operations here. Like, can we really say that you're not a number? Do you guys accept that kind of binary allocation of a person's being?
After I got my English degree, I got an accounting degree because I didn't want to teach, which, is an ironic part of my life. But, accounting and it's the same thing that Cheryl said about what we are doing in grammar school, I was ready and able to do accounting, even though my love was literature and history and all of those humanities subjects. I don't have a love for math, as I've made clear in the past, but I was ready because I knew how to study. I knew how to think. And so I was able to succeed. I did not have a good math science background in high school at all. And I didn't take a lot of math and science in college. But as we think now about our students, we feel like by the time they get to high school science, which is hard, that they are, because we've taught them all the skills to be good studiers, they can master it.
Well, and the irony is that the best writers are writers who are grounded in the things of the world. They're people who can use words referring to specific things to evoke something. And I'm seeing that with my Antonia. I mean, it's a it's a book that's really grounded in the concrete experience of actual things in the world. And that's what makes it a great book. That's what makes her a great writer. And so you can't really divorce the two. I mean, literature and the world are intimately connected. And we are beings in the cosmos, and we're the only being in the cosmos who can wonder at it. And so I think that's really just a kind of a false dichotomy.
Well, Shane, you said false dichotomy. You asked, are there word people? Are there math people? And instead of saying a false dichotomy, I would say it kind of goes too far to the extreme. Do people have affinities? Absolutely.
Right.
But the problem is when we take that affinity and say, that's the only thing I'm good at. And I am very grateful for my education because it pushed me in the language department. When my father is an accountant, I do have an affinity for math. But, because my education pushed me into language, like I learned an appreciation for literature and for history and for language itself that I would not have otherwise had, right? If I had just said, well, I'm a math guy, I can't do that stuff well. It was, it was content rich there, and it made me more, it made me sort of more well-formed, well-rounded as a person. That I if I had bought into I just can do math, well, that's all I would be doing.
Which brings us back to our last podcast, right? Where we talked about tracking students in, did you say 8th grade? They start tracking them and you decide I'm a math person or I'm a literature person or I'm a history person.
This is the worst thing you can do.
We've got to do it all. These students deserve it all, and we need to do it all well.
You need balance. Pete Rose, who was one of the great baseball players, played for the Cincinnati
And one of the great
Reds.
cheaters.
What's that?
And one of the great cheaters.
Yes, but that he was still very skilled. He was also a great
Sometimes
cheater.
this stuff just is.
Yeah, it was a gambling scandal that put him. But he made this great comment. He was asked one time, What made you how did you become such a great baseball player? And he said, I practice the things I'm not good at. And I think that's a principle we need to apply in education more often. If there's things we're weak on, we don't just drop those things and then just continue to do the things we're strong at doing. We need to balance it out. And people like me, literature philosophy person, I need to be doing things like this to balance myself.
Yeah, that's good. So the answer is, if there's such a thing as a word person, then yes, they should have classical education.
Yes.
And if there's such a thing as a math and science person, yes, they should have classical education.
That's right.
All right. Thanks for this conversation. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Classical Etc. If you'd like to show your support for the show, then you can leave a like below. If you'd like to add your voice to the conversation, then you can comment. And if you want to follow along with us on this journey, then please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.